To learn how Scrum fits together as a framework, we need to look at the components it is made up of. We also need to learn about some of the lingo used in the Scrum Guide, starting with empiricism. Empiricism asserts that knowledge comes from experience, and that we should make decisions based on what is observed. Applied, it is called the empirical process, and consists of three branches: transparency, inspection, and adaptation. That is, transparency, through making the work visible; inspection, by analyzing what is visible and comparing what you find with where you would like to be; and adaptation, enacting a change that you believe, based on your analysis, to get you closer to where you want to be. That should suffice for the purposes of this video. So what about the different components of Scrum? I will go over the name, function, and some of the basic rules for each component. And if you want to learn more about how they interact with each other in practice, keep an eye out for the Scrum Deep Dive video on this channel. Now, there are 14 core components of Scrum, categorized as follows: 3 accountabilities, 5 events, 3 artifacts, and 3 commitments. So let's begin with the 3 accountabilities, or as you may know them, roles, as they were called in previous versions of the Scrum Guide. Meet the product owner. The product owner is accountable for maximizing the value of the product resulting from the work of the Scrum team, and is also accountable for the effective management of the product backlog. The product owner is only ever one person, not a committee, and there's only one product owner per product. Whilst they are accountable for effectively managing the product backlog, they may delegate the responsibility of doing it to others, and for them to succeed, their decisions must be respected by the organization. Next are the amazing developers. They are accountable for instilling quality into the product by adhering to a definition of done, and for creating and managing the sprint backlog. The developers are committed to creating any aspect of a usable increment and are the ones who decide how they go about doing it. They also adapt the sprint backlog each day as needed in order to achieve the sprint goal. And there may be several developers in a Scrum team. It is worth noting that the term developer includes anyone doing any of the work needed to create an increment. For example, design, marketing, analysis, construction, testing, maintenance, and research. Last but not least, we have the Scrum Master. The Scrum Master is accountable for establishing Scrum as defined in the Scrum Guide, and for the effectiveness of the Scrum team. There is only one Scrum Master per Scrum team, and they are a true leader that serves both the Scrum team and the organization by, for example, facilitating events as needed or requested, helping everyone to understand Scrum theory and practice, helping establish empirical product planning, leading, training, and coaching the organization in Scrum adoption, and the removal of impediments, that is, problems the Scrum team cannot resolve themselves. So that's the 3 accountabilities covered. And before we look at the Scrum team as a whole, it is time to expand on the definition of a particular word we've been using quite a bit so far: accountable. It is important to point out the difference in the English language between accountable and responsible, as this matters when we talk about Scrum, and that distinction is not present in most other languages. Here is my super short summary. The one responsible must do the work. The one accountable is at fault if it is not done. A slightly negative spin, perhaps, but it will serve us sufficiently for the moment. Now, for the most part, the Scrum team operates more effectively if the ones accountable are also the ones responsible for carrying out the work. But this is of course dependent on any contextual needs. Which leads us, at last, to the Scrum team. The Scrum team is, as a whole, accountable for creating a valuable, useful increment every sprint. They are both self-managing and cross-functional. But what does that mean? Well, let's quickly expand on those terms. Self-managing means that the Scrum team internally decides who does what, when, and how. And cross-functional means that they have all the skills within the Scrum team to create value each sprint. It is recommended to keep the Scrum team to 10 people or fewer, small enough to be nimble, whilst large enough to deliver significant value each sprint. There may be multiple Scrum teams working towards the same product. That's our people covered. Now onwards to the 3 artifacts, along with their 3 commitments. First up is the product goal and the product backlog. The product goal is the commitment which defines the desired future state of the product. and helps inform the creation and contents of the product backlog. The product goal is part of the product backlog and is created and communicated by the product owner. The product goal must be both measurable and achievable, and only one product goal exists at a time, with a new one being created upon completing or cancelling the existing one. The product backlog, then, is the artifact which makes transparent the ordered list of all improvements that can be made to the product. It is emergent, meaning that it changes as the Scrum team learns more about what is needed in order to achieve the product goal. The work in the product backlog is referred to as product backlog items, or PBIs for short, and can be represented in all kinds of ways, like user stories, features, problem statements, or even coffee stain napkins with notes scribbled in lipstick. These product backlog items are usually best expressed as valuable outcomes, and there is only one product goal and product backlog per product. In fact, a useful rule of thumb is that if the word product is involved, there should only be one of each. One product owner, one product goal, and one product backlog. Next up is the sprint goal and sprint backlog. The sprint goal is the commitment which makes transparent what the Scrum team believes will be of value for the stakeholders. And like the product goal, the sprint goal informs the creation and emergence of the sprint backlog throughout the sprint. The sprint goal is created collaboratively by the whole Scrum team and is part of the sprint backlog. There is only one sprint goal for each sprint, and with it being a commitment, it does not change throughout the duration of the sprint. The sprint goal should be focused, containing no ands, commas, or bullet points. The sprint backlog is the artifact that holds the product backlog items that the developers forecast are needed in order to achieve the sprint goal, as well as their plan of how to turn them into increments. While the sprint goal is created collaboratively by the Scrum team, the rest of the sprint backlog is created and managed by the developers. Much like the product backlog, the sprint backlog emerges throughout the sprint as the developers learn more about what is needed to achieve the sprint goal. The developers may break down the product backlog items in the sprint backlog into items doable in a day or less, if they think that would be beneficial. Last but not least, we have the increment and the definition of done. The definition of done is the commitment which makes transparent the minimum quality of any delivered increment to the stakeholders, and the definition of done informs the creation of any future increment. The definition of done is first and foremost provided by the organization, and is likely to include any existing standards or guidelines like design, engineering, or compliance. Should one not be provided, then the Scrum team creates one. The definition of done must reflect a minimum standard of quality that renders any subsequent increment usable. If multiple Scrum teams are working on the same product, they share the same definition of done, and all work must integrate into one increment at the end of each sprint. Any undone work at the end of the sprint is returned to the product backlog. Now for the increment. It is the artifact which acts as a concrete stepping stone towards the product goal, and is the only true measure of progress that the Scrum team and stakeholders should rely on. An increment is created when a product backlog item meets the definition of done, without breaking any prior increment. An increment can be released by the product owner at any time during the sprint. And whilst an increment must be created each sprint, it does not have to be released each sprint. The whole purpose of Scrum is the creation of done increments. That is all the artifacts and commitments covered. And before we move on, it is important to know that all the artifacts and commitments must be transparent. That is, they must be visible to the Scrum team and stakeholders at all times. This is to enable increased transparency. With that sorted, it's time for the Scrum team and stakeholders to fulfill the other two branches of empiricism. And this is where the 5 events come in, each representing an opportunity to inspect and adapt. First up is the sprint itself. The sprint acts as a risk limiter by ensuring the Scrum team and stakeholders inspect and adapt any progress towards the product goal at least once per month. The sprint has a time box of a month or less. The length and timing of the sprint and the events within are determined by the Scrum team. The sprint is the container event within which the other 4 events take place. And there is no time between sprints, meaning all the work needed to achieve the product goal has to occur within a sprint. Only the product owner can cancel a sprint. Next up is the first event of the sprint, sprint planning. This is where the Scrum team inspects the product goal and product backlog and adapt the sprint goal and sprint backlog. It is time boxed to 8 hours or less, and the Scrum team attends and may invite others for them to provide advice. The Scrum team is now hard at work to deliver a valuable increment, and the developers get together for the daily Scrum. It is a daily event for the developers to inspect their progress towards the sprint goal and adapt the sprint backlog based on what they've learned. The daily Scrum is time boxed to 15 minutes or less. It is for the developers by the developers, and they decide how to facilitate the event as long as it remains focused on creating a plan on how to achieve the sprint goal. While others may observe, only the developers participate. It is not the only time in the day that the developers can plan. The next to last event in the sprint review, is where the Scrum team collaborates with the stakeholders to inspect the outcomes of the sprint and adapt the product backlog. The sprint review is time boxed to 4 hours or less. It is a working session where the Scrum team and stakeholders share and learn together about where they are now and where they think they should go next. No undone work may be presented at the sprint review. Finally, the humble sprint retrospective. It is the last event and marks the end of the sprint. Here, the Scrum team comes together to inspect the sprint itself and adapt how they work together in order to improve the Scrum team's effectiveness and quality. The sprint retrospective is time boxed to 3 hours or less, and only the Scrum team attends. And this is where the Scrum team would make any changes to the definition of done or their event timings and lengths in preparation for the next sprint. Whilst no longer mandatory, should they not have been able to implement it during the sprint retrospective, it is generally a good idea for the Scrum team to include at least one identified improvement to the sprint backlog of the following sprint. And that, dear viewer, means we have covered all the components of Scrum. And here they are, all together in a framework view. Now, the extra nerdy amongst you may have noticed I did not mention the Scrum values, and that is because it wasn't possible to do them justice in this shorter video. But without them, none of this functions as intended. They are called the lifeblood of Scrum for a reason. And that is all for this time. And if you'd like to learn more about how you might leverage Scrum to turn ideas into value, join me in the next video, the deep dive, where I'll expand on how this all comes together in practice by using an example product to show how we might leverage Scrum to turn ideas into value. Thank you for watching.